on board a flight meant to embody luxury and exclusivity. A black man takes his seat quietly, dressed modestly, yet carrying an unspoken weight far heavier than his luggage. From the moment he boards, eyes flicker with suspicion, and whispers weave through the cabin. Small acts of exclusion and cold disregard paint a story of prejudice hidden beneath polished service. But beneath the surface of silent scorn lies a truth so powerful it will shatter assumptions and turn privilege on its head. This is a story about injustice, resilience, and a revelation no one saw coming. If this journey draws you in, please like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps bring these truths to light. The only detail that might linger in memory was a pale scar along his right wrist, narrow but deep, the kind that came from something sharp and years ago. As he stepped into the jet bridge, he felt the drop in temperature that came not from the air conditioning, but from perception. The moment when eyes glanced his way and chose to ignore him. No greetings, no polite nods, just a subtle withdrawal, as if his presence shifted the temperature of the space he entered. The cabin doors opened with a soft hiss, and the world of first class revealed itself in amber lighting and soft jazz music. Passengers were already settling into oversized leather seats, the air laced with perfume and the scent of heated towels. Laughter floated from the front rows. A man scrolled a tablet with a stylus like he was signing contracts at 30,000 feet. A woman stretched in branded loungewear, flexing diamond bangles as she adjusted her silk eye mask. Elridge checked the number printed on his boarding pass, 3A. He stepped down the aisle slowly, quietly, and reached his seat near the window. It was unoccupied. The overhead bin was open. He gently lifted his canvas duffel, an old thing soft from years of use, and tucked it inside, careful not to disturb the bags beside it. He eased into the seat, set his ticket in the armrest slot, and let out a breath. He looked out the window where the sky bled gold over the tarmac, planes inching across sunlit lines like chess pieces on a mirrored board. He didn't close his eyes, not yet. He just sat still, unnoticed, absorbing the hum of wealth around him. It took only minutes for the silence to break. A flight attendant with a crisp bun and tight blazer moved past, then paused beside him. Her name tag read Jessica. She stared at him for a moment too long, her lips pinching together. She didn't ask for his name or boarding pass. Instead, she walked several rows back, leaned toward a colleague, and whispered something. They both glanced his way. The other shrugged. Jessica's brow creased with something between suspicion and irritation. Then she returned. Without speaking, she leaned over his headrest, removed the plush embroidered cover bearing the airline's gold insignia, and replaced it with a plain white one from the economy section. Her hand brushed his shoulder as she worked, intentional or not. When she finished, she stepped back and offered a smile so tight it looked painted on. Then she turned and walked away. Elridge said nothing. His eyes flicked toward the new cover, then back to the window. A quiet thud echoed in his chest. The next sign came wrapped in subtlety. When a tray of pre-flight champagne made its way down the aisle, Jessica and another attendant served rows 1 and 2 with grace. Glass flutes, chilled bottles, folded napkins. When they reached row 3, the cart paused. Jessica looked at Elridge, then continued past without offering him anything. The passenger next to him, a man in an expensive linen shirt and gold cufflinks, received a glass and a smile. Elridge was left with nothing. The man sipped his drink and glanced sideways at Elridge, then looked away as if the proximity made him uncomfortable. A soft chuckle came from the aisle behind, too quiet to address, but loud enough to sting. Elridge looked down at his hands. He folded them tightly in his lap. The plane began to taxi. Safety instructions played. Seat belts clicked. Engines hummed. And still, no one spoke to him. At cruising altitude, the hum of discrimination grew louder in silence. Jessica returned with snacks and drinks. Every row was offered warm towels, artisanal almonds, and neatly plated hors d'oeuvres. Elridge received a paper cup filled halfway with lukewarm water, dropped unceremoniously on his tray. No eye contact, no words, no towel. The cup tipped slightly as the plane bumped through minor turbulence. splashing a few drops onto his jeans. He wiped them quietly with the sleeve of his cardigan. No one noticed. Or perhaps everyone did and chose not to. The cabin settled into dimmed lighting. A few passengers pulled out blankets. Others closed their eyes. Elridge sat upright, too aware of his surroundings to rest. The man beside him adjusted his seat and leaned slightly away, careful not to let their elbows touch. The sound of a soft jazz playlist faded into the ambient buzz of high-altitude travel. A child a few rows ahead turned around, looked at Elridge, and whispered something to their mother. She turned the child forward, her hand tightening on his shoulder. Another signal, another message. He didn't belong. Not here. Not among them. The final blow of the night came not in action, but in absence. Jessica moved through the cabin with the in-flight magazine bundle. Each passenger received one: glossy covers, luxury ads, interviews with CEOs. When she reached Elridge's row, she didn't even slow down. She handed a magazine to the man beside him and walked past as if the seat at 3A was empty. That was the moment something inside Elridge pressed deep, like a bruise spreading inward. The man seated beside him had long since pulled a thick blanket over his lap and was now watching a movie with expensive noise-canceling headphones clamped over his ears. Elridge could hear faint sound bleeding from them, swells of music, fragments of dialogue, while he himself was left without even the offer of headphones. The in-flight entertainment system blinked quietly in front of him, useless. No one had given him the access code card required to activate it. He'd watched the menu loop twice already. Somewhere down the aisle, laughter broke out again. Not the relaxed, joyful kind, but the short burst of shared mockery, the kind that ended with eyes darting to check if their target had heard. Elridge didn't look. He didn't want confirmation, not from a young man in row for who'd been side-eyeing him since boarding, not from the attendant who kept pausing near them, as if they needed extra attention. He focused instead on his hands, resting still on his lap, fingers interlocked to keep them from reacting. Those hands had once held signatures worth billions. Now, they gripped only restraint. He tried to distract himself, but even small comforts were denied. The man next to him had pulled out a large magazine with glossy pages and was flipping through slowly, page by page, occasionally making amused noises. Elridge had tried to do the same earlier, only for a passing crew member to remove the magazine from his hands without a word, tucking it back into the seatback in front of another passenger. No explanation, no apology, just the quiet assertion that it wasn't meant for him. That message had been clear, and now it echoed through every small gesture on this plane. The dinner service began just as the plane hit mild turbulence. Jessica and another attendant began moving carefully through the rows, pushing a sleek metal cart adorned with silver trays and real glassware. The scent of warm bread and grilled fish filled the cabin. It reached Elridge, stirring hunger that he hadn't noticed until then. His tray table remained lowered, ready. He waited as the cart drew closer, stopping at the row in front of him. There, the attendants laid out full meals, entrees and covered dishes, wine options, folded napkins. Then came row 3. Elridge kept his gaze forward. He heard the soft rustle of movement beside him as the man next to him received his meal with a grateful smile. Jessica turned her body slightly to the left as she reached Elridge's seat. Without looking him in the eye, she placed a small plastic container on his tray. It was sealed with a dull white sticker labeled vegetarian snack option. No cutlery, no bread, no napkin, no drink. She walked away before he could even glance up. Elridge stared at the container. Inside were a few carrot sticks, 2 dry crackers, and a packet of hummus. The foil top of the hummus had already begun to peel at the edge, like it had been handled before. The man beside him glanced at Elridge's tray and blinked. He looked down at his own meal, a thick cut of salmon, herb rice, a glass of white wine, and quickly turned back to his screen. Elridge could see the tension in the man's shoulders. Even he wasn't sure how to justify the difference. Elridge picked up the plastic container, turned it in his hands, then placed it back down. He didn't eat. He didn't have the appetite anymore. It wasn't until halfway through the flight that the next shift came. passengers had settled into post-meal drowsiness. The lights were off except for the soft glow of personal reading lamps. Elridge leaned slightly to adjust his position, careful not to disturb anyone. As he did, he noticed something strange in the overhead compartment. His duffel bag, which he had carefully placed above his seat at boarding, was no longer there. In its place was a sleek silver suitcase with a monogrammed leather tag. He rose halfway from his seat and opened the bin gently, double-checking. No mistake. His bag was gone. He looked up and down the aisle, unsure where to start. Across from him, Jessica appeared again, this time with a clipboard. She paused, looked directly at him for the first time since the flight began, and said nothing. Her expression was unreadable. Then she turned and walked to the back of the cabin. Elridge sat down, his pulse quickening just enough to feel in his fingertips. He'd packed nothing controversial, just a change of clothes, a travel book, a printed report for a quiet meeting he was scheduled to attend the next morning. Nothing important enough to be taken, but nothing so worthless that it should disappear without a word. A note had been left inside the bin, white paper, handwritten in blue pen, for words underlined once, moved to rear storage. That was it. No name, no signature, just another quiet message that said, in so many unspoken ways, you do not belong here. He remained seated, back straight, staring at the carpeted floor beneath his feet. His limbs ached, not from the flight, but from the effort of holding himself together. He hadn't made a scene. He hadn't challenged his soul. And yet the hostility moved around him like weather. Passive, chilling, inevitable. When he looked up, a few passengers were watching him. Not all with disdain. Some with curiosity. One with thinly veiled pity. No one spoke. No one intervened. Elridge, still upright, hadn't moved his own tray, not because he was content, but because no one had returned to take it. The plastic cup of warm water still sat there, half full, and now cooling into room temperature mediocrity. When the lights came up for the second round of service, the glow felt sterile, exposing. Flight attendants glided down the aisle, smiling with mechanical ease, their attention skipping over his row like a stone over water. Jessica passed him again without a glance, arms full of blankets which he gently placed on the laps of the other passengers. Row after row received attention. Even the empty seats received fluffed pillows and tucked linens. But when she reached Elridge, her pace quickened, her eyes fixed forward. No blanket, no acknowledgement, just silence. He shifted slightly, his legs growing stiff, but even that movement drew a glance from a man across the aisle, who lowered his newspaper just enough to observe, then raised it again with a quiet smirk. Elridge pressed himself back against the headrest and stared at the ceiling, fighting the mounting urge to disappear deeper into the chair. He thought of saying something, perhaps a single sentence, not a protest, but a question. Where is my bag? Or may I get a blanket? But the words stuck to the inside of his throat like cement. He had done this dance before. He knew the steps. The price of asking was often higher than the discomfort of silence. The minutes passed, then an hour. The sound of a baby crying broke through from economy, a distant reminder of another world behind the curtain. But here, in this curated realm of artificial calm, the oppression didn't come in noise. It came in the refusal to be seen. A thin man in a burgundy suit across the aisle unbuckled and stood, stretching as if preparing for a yoga class. He looked down at Elridge, made eye contact briefly, and then looked away with a dismissive exhale. As he stepped into the aisle, he gestured toward the flight attendant behind him, and though Elridge couldn't hear the words, the meaning was clear. A nod toward Elridge, a raised brow, a shake of the head. Moments later, Jessica reappeared with a spray bottle and a sanitizing wipe. She stopped beside Elridge's seat and wordlessly wiped down the armrest he had touched. She didn't ask to reach around him. She didn't explain. She simply leaned in, wiped, and left without making eye contact, as if he were a stain rather than a man. The chill wasn't just from the AC vent above his head. It settled into his skin, into his muscles, into his lungs. His breathing slowed. Each inhale was measured, like holding steady through a storm. Another attendant approached with a clipboard. She wasn't Jessica. This one was younger, her eyes darting as if uncertain where to focus. She scanned the rows, her pen moving quickly, checking passengers one by one. When she reached Elridge, her pace slowed for a beat. She glanced at him, then down at her list, and hesitated. Elridge watched her carefully, and for a moment, she seemed unsure whether to acknowledge him at all. She wrote something, turned, and continued down the aisle. A few rows ahead, the man in the burgundy suit now occupied a jump seat usually reserved for crew during landing. He reclined slightly, sipping espresso from a ceramic cup. When Jessica passed him, they exchanged whispers, and again, both of them looked back at Elridge. He didn't flinch. He just watched them watch him. And once again, he recognized that look, dismissive curiosity, the kind reserved for an anomaly, not a threat, but a disruption in symmetry. Later, as dinner trays were cleared, another cart came through offering dessert. The menu listed dark chocolate souffle, key lime tart, and fresh fruit with honey. The man beside him was asked his preference and responded eagerly. Elridge was not asked. The cart rolled past, and no offer was made. But then came the worst part. As the plane began its descent toward cruising altitude again after a minor dip, the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing a brief bout of turbulence. Seatbelt lights flickered back on. Flight attendants quickly made their rounds to ensure passengers were secure. Jessica moved swiftly, checking latches, giving quick instructions, tightening straps. She stopped at Elridge's row, checked the seatbelt of the man beside him, then stepped over his legs and moved on. She didn't even glance at Elridge. He reached down and tugged at his own seatbelt, double-checking the clasp, pulling it tight enough to press into his hip. He looked up, unsure if he had missed a chance to be acknowledged, but there was no one watching. He was invisible again. The lights flickered slightly during the rough patch, and a few passengers gasped softly. Someone called out for a drink of water. Another laughed nervously. A flight attendant rushed to respond. Not to Elridge. Not once. He sat through it alone, body tensed, eyes locked on the seat back in front of him, ears tuned only to the sound of others being cared for while he was bypassed completely. When the turbulence passed and the lights returned to their normal glow, a new round of refreshments began. This time, Jessica came by offering hot towels. With a practiced motion, she placed one on the hands of the man beside Elridge, then skipped him entirely. Elridge looked down at his hands, now dry and calloused from the recycled air and lack of care. He rubbed them slowly together, a ritual not of cleansing, but of grounding. He remembered when his hands once signed executive decisions that influenced entire sectors, when those same fingers were clasped by world leaders, photographed at charity galas. Now, they remained unnoticed, unrecognized, unworthy of a single cloth square soaked in warm water. As the cabin settled into another lull, he caught his reflection again in the small black screen in front of him. He looked tired, not old, just tired in a way that didn't show up in years. The fatigue of containment, of enduring, of being dismissed, not because of a mistake, but because of an assumption. It began to take form in glances, smirks, and the subtle coordination of eyes and body language meant to belittle without a word. It began with a whisper. From somewhere behind him, he heard the unmistakable breath of laughter, stifled but sharp, followed by a whispered comment that ended with a short burst of quiet snickering. He didn't need to hear the words. The tone was universal. It was the sound of two people agreeing on someone else's humiliation. Elridge kept his gaze forward. The seat back in front of him, still adorned with the magazine he'd been denied earlier, now felt like a billboard of exclusion. He focused on the stitching along the edge of the headrest, following its neat, methodical line as though it might pull him out of the moment. But it didn't. The mocking continued. Every few minutes, another breathy laugh, another whisper, another nudge from one passenger to another, a glance thrown toward his row with thinly veiled amusement. Their eyes did not linger long. They didn't have to. Their intention was not to confront him directly, but to slowly chip away at the edges of his composure, to salt the wound they'd already created through isolation. Across the aisle, a man reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small silver bottle of cologne. He spritzed it generously, then tilted his head in Elridge's direction as if trying to mask something offensive. The scent, sharp and chemical, filled the air. The man offered a smirk to the woman beside him, and she laughed lightly, her hand covering her mouth as she leaned closer. Elridge breathed through his nose, slow and deliberate, controlling the rising burn in his chest. He had not spoken a word to anyone, had touched nothing he was not allowed to, had made no complaint, and yet somehow his restraint itself had become offensive. That quiet dignity, once his armor, had become their target. Their need to see him flinch was now palpable. A flight attendant, this one with a long blonde ponytail and a new name tag, Courtney, approached his row carrying a tray of after-dinner mints and tea service. She smiled as she passed the tray to the man next to Elridge, offering options and accepting polite decline. When she turned slightly toward Elridge, she paused, looked him over with a tilt of the head that suggested amusement, then simply skipped to the next row without extending the tray. Elridge didn't even blink. He sat motionless, eyes locked on a point ahead. He could see his reflection faintly in the blank screen of the entertainment system. His own image stared back, eyes tired but focused, jawline tense. Then came the false alarm. A soft ding echoed through the cabin, the passenger call light illuminating above his seat. Jessica reappeared within seconds, her posture brisk, a folded cloth napkin in her hand. She glanced at the light, then at Elridge. "Did you call?" she asked, though her tone was more accusation than inquiry. He shook his head once, slowly. He had not touched the button. She looked past him and caught the gaze of the man seated behind, who raised both hands in mock innocence. She narrowed her eyes and walked away without another word, her annoyance marked clearly in the heavy stomp of her heels. As she disappeared up the aisle, the man behind Elridge chuckled again, louder this time. He leaned forward just enough for Elridge to feel the change in air pressure behind his seat. The next sound was a low hum, someone recording a video, perhaps, or taking a picture. Elridge did not turn. He understood that even the act of responding could be used against him. He had been filmed before, not as a man of stature or significance, but as a curiosity, a token to be ridiculed in hushed tones and forgotten within minutes. This wasn't new. This was simply worse because it came wrapped in luxury, because it was done with manicured hands and polite smiles and corporate uniforms. A few moments later, the overhead bins began to rattle slightly with the shift in altitude, and passengers adjusted their posture in anticipation of descent. The crew made another round, checking trays, collecting leftover dishes, and securing loose items. When Courtney reached Elridge again, she moved without speaking, swiftly pulling his tray forward, knocking the plastic cup onto his pants and spilling the cold water across his thighs. She paused, met his eyes for the first time, and without apology or assistance, turned to continue collecting other trays. The water soaked into the fabric of his khakis, darkening the material in a slow, creeping pattern. The cold reached his skin, and for a moment, he sat perfectly still, absorbing the sensation. The man beside him chuckled softly, not looking directly at him, but clearly watching from the corner of his eye. Elridge blinked once, closed his eyes for a breath, and reopened them. He took the napkin tucked into his unused vegetarian snack box and dabbed lightly at the stain. It did nothing. It was more ritual than remedy, a way to maintain dignity even as it leaked away drop by drop. No one offered help. No one even acknowledged the spill. Across the aisle, two passengers shared a smirk, their eyes darting between the stain and the indifferent flight attendant now disappearing to the galley. The message was clear. He was a joke, and worse, he was not allowed to respond. The last strike of the hour came when a passenger in a tailored navy suit stood up, looked directly at Elridge, and then whispered to Jessica as she passed. She returned minutes later with a clipboard and whispered back, pointing discreetly toward Elridge's seat. The man was quietly moved 2 rows up, granted a better seat and a wider recline. The implication was unmistakable. Sitting near Elridge was a discomfort the airline felt obliged to fix. The aisle remained active with motion, passengers shifting in their seats, crew members exchanging trays, conversations whispered across armrests, but none of that movement acknowledged him. The seat next to him remained unoccupied, a void that deepened his exile. If before they ignored him, now they had reshaped the flight around his presence, removing people from proximity as if he carried a contagion of inconvenience. As Courtney passed again with a cart of late-night refreshment options, she paused at his row without looking at him, her body slightly angled to avoid facing his seat directly. She set a napkin and a single sealed cookie on the tray next to his elbow, so quickly and without word it felt accidental. Then she offered the full menu cheese plate, dessert wine, warm croissants to the passenger behind him, who accepted with cheer. The cart didn't linger at Elridge's side, nor did she ask if he wanted anything else. The isolation had evolved. Now it was systemic. It wasn't about forgetting or failing to serve him. It was a deliberate choreography designed to exclude him from the theater of service entirely. Even when he did receive something, it was a shadow of what others enjoyed. It was rationed. It was secondary. And above all, it was silent. He broke the cookie in half slowly, not to eat, but to give his hand something to do. He didn't want it. It tasted dry, like the air, and left a film on his tongue. But he forced himself to chew, to swallow, to pretend for a moment that he had chosen this, that the fragment of a gesture passed off as service was sufficient. It wasn't. But to show that would be to surrender the only weapon he had left, restraint. Another hour passed, and with it came another layer of detachment. When the flight attendants made their next sweep to collect trash, no one stopped at his row. Jessica passed directly by without even glancing at his tray. He waited, expecting her to return. She didn't. Crumbs gathered beside the empty cup. The cookie wrapper lay flat, untouched. The trash remained there, as if a symbol of what they thought of his space, a mess not worth cleaning, a presence not worth acknowledging. From behind, a passenger sneezed. Jessica hurried to hand him tissues, sanitizer, and a fresh towel. She even brought warm tea without being asked. Elridge observed it all with the same silence he had carried since boarding. His throat was dry, but he didn't ask for anything. His back ached, but he didn't shift. He sat like a fixture, no longer a man in their eyes, but a misplaced object waiting to be corrected. At one point, the cabin lights brightened slightly, signaling the approach of the mid-flight walk-around. Crew members adjusted curtains, checked on passengers, and offered mid-journey updates. When Courtney arrived at Elridge's row, she paused just long enough to tap her tablet, logging something about the seat. She didn't speak to him, didn't meet his eyes, and didn't ask if he was comfortable. She recorded data, confirmed his position as present, and moved on. It was not service, it was surveillance. Then came the magazine. Not the in-flight one he'd been denied earlier, but a deluxe travel issue passed hand to hand between several passengers. They laughed at certain pages, pointed at luxury destinations, traded comments about villas and private islands. The woman across the aisle lowered her copy and looked over at Elridge, as if curious about his reaction. He gave none. Her gaze lingered a second longer than most, and then she turned to the man beside her, whispered something, and they both smiled. Whatever they thought of him, it was likely less than human. The smell of breakfast began to waft through the cabin as the crew prepared the pre-landing meal. Though still several hours from descent, the staff began setting up trays and checking preferences. Jessica carried a list of orders. She visited every seat, confirming selections with quiet smiles. But when she reached row 3, she hesitated for only a moment, glanced toward Elridge, then skipped to the passenger behind him. She never asked him what he preferred. Minutes later, a cover tray was placed on his table without warning. The lid was scratched, the utensils mismatched. He lifted the cover to find a pale omelet, rubbery and cool, a slice of dry toast, and a fruit cup already leaking juice into the paper lining. It was not the curated selection offered to others. There were no choices, no extras, no garnishes. No one said a word. Elridge took a bite, not from hunger, but from ritual. The food had no flavor. He swallowed, chewed again, and swallowed again. It filled his stomach, but emptied something else. Something harder to define. The cabin lights had begun their slow fade into morning mode, casting a dull amber hue across the first-class cabin like a theatrical glow before the final act. But for Elridge Monroe, there had been no intermission, no relief, and no break from the relentless campaign of quiet cruelty that had followed him since he stepped aboard. The thin blanket folded neatly over his lap now held the chill of unacknowledged suffering, and the air he breathed tasted faintly of citrus and steel, sterile in the way luxury often masked its sharpest edges. Around him, the world moved forward. Flight attendants smiled with tired efficiency, refreshing trays and resetting glasses, while passengers chatted softly or reclined in half-sleep, some rubbing the sleep from their eyes while sipping espresso brought before they could ask. Elridge, by contrast, sat in the same stiff posture, back straight, jaw set, his gaze blank and fixed on a point just above the headrest in front of him, not because there was anything to look at, but because there was nowhere else left for his focus to go. The tray in front of him, stained with the remnants of a breakfast no one had asked him to choose, remained untouched after the first few mechanical bites. The fruit cup had leaked further, seeping a trail of sticky syrup across the tray table and onto his palm, but no one returned to clear it. No one had offered him the warm towel others received, or the after-meal mint, or even water. It was no longer just isolation, it was disassembly. Every detail around him reminded him of how deeply he had been removed from the human experience of the flight. Not once had his name been spoken. Not once had he been looked at directly unless it was to confirm some suspicion or justify another slight. Conversations had continued around him like he was made of glass, visible but not real, present but ignorable. The passengers closest to him now had shifted their bodies slightly away, shoulders turned just enough to make it clear that even proximity to him was a discomfort. One had gone so far as to request a seat change in whispers, which Jessica had obliged with a kind smile, taking his new drink order with enthusiasm before returning to Elridge's row without a glance. He was now alone in a space designed for intimacy and comfort, and the emptiness beside him had become another wall, another message wrapped in velvet cruelty. As he reached for the call button, not to complain, not to accuse, but simply to ask for a napkin to clean the syrup from his hand, his finger paused inches away. The memory of Jessica's earlier reaction, the tone in her voice when she had asked if he'd called the last time the light activated, stopped him. That look, that implication that he was being difficult or disruptive, played again in his mind like a warning. He withdrew his hand, wiped it against his cardigan quietly, and folded his fingers again into his lap. More whispers floated from the row behind him. The laughter was louder now, less restrained, no longer concealed behind coughs or gestures. He caught only fragments. Should have stayed in coach. He probably snuck up here. Look at his shoes. But the intent didn't need full sentences. Every word was chosen to strip him of identity, to reduce him to a symbol of misplacement. They didn't know his name. They didn't need to. To them, he was already a caricature. Courtney appeared again with the drink cart, smiling at every row, taking detailed orders and offering alternatives. When she reached aside, she reached over him, without speaking, adjusted the tray above, and moved on. No offer, no drink, just a quick movement, impersonal and dismissive, as though he were the armrest she had to lean past. He felt something break in his chest, not loudly, not like shattering glass, but like the quiet crack of wood under pressure, subtle but irreversible. The damage wasn't new. It was simply surfacing now. Decades of being underestimated, mistrusted, scrutinized, and reduced had taught him endurance. But even stone wears down under constant exposure. His fingers twitched slightly against his thighs. He pressed them flat. Not yet. Not here. The loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing a slight delay in landing due to weather near their destination. The collective groan from the cabin was light, a chorus of mild inconvenience. For Elridge, it was an extension of confinement. He wasn't just tired, he was being unraveled. As the captain finished his announcement, the man who had requested to move earlier walked back down the aisle toward the restroom. He passed Elridge's row, then stopped, looked down, and smirked. His eyes roamed Elridge's cardigan, his khakis, the now dried stain from the water spill. He gave a soft chuckle, not kind, not humorous, but mocking in the way bullies perfected in childhood. Elridge didn't look up. He didn't have to. The weight of that stare was familiar. Once the man disappeared behind the lavatory door, Courtney returned to the galley. She leaned into a brief conversation with Jessica, and though Elridge couldn't hear them, both their eyes darted toward him more than once. Jessica rolled her eyes, nodded toward something, his seat, his tray, something she found amusing, and then laughed. Courtney smirked, turned back, and continued her duties as if that small shared joke were just another part of the day. The message was clear, even louder now than the whispered comments or mocking glances. The flight crew was not indifferent to his suffering. They were part of it. They enforced it, sustained it, and now they seemed to enjoy it. He was no longer just isolated. He was targeted. The seatbelt light clicked on again, and the cabin prepared for descent, trays being cleared, seats being reset. Courtney returned to his row, this time without the cart. She paused, reached down, and roughly took the tray from his table without warning, causing the remaining juice from the fruit cup to slosh and spill again across the already stained surface. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the mess. She turned and walked away as if he were a problem solved. As the landing checklist began, Elridge sat completely still. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time, he didn't stop them. He let the vibration run through him, small but visible. For others, this was the moment they began to shake off the discomfort of a long flight, preparing to step into meetings, reunions, vacations. For Elridge, it was another stage in the long ritual of being dismissed, diminished, and erased. Jessica passed by with a clipboard in hand again, checking seat numbers, lips moving with internal confirmation, eyes flicking to each passenger briefly to verify compliance. When she reached row 3, her gaze hovered only for a moment on the empty seat beside him, then moved on without a word. Her entire body language had shifted over the course of the flight, from performative professionalism to open avoidance, and Elridge had noticed each evolution. His presence had become a burden, one that weighed nothing in physical mass, but pressed heavily on every exchange. As the wheels beneath the aircraft locked into place, and the pressure in the cabin subtly shifted, so did something in him. He glanced around and saw not faces, but habits, people conditioned to look away, trained by unspoken rules to maintain comfort at the cost of another's dignity. The man across the aisle adjusted his gold cufflinks and whispered something to the woman beside him, who let out a small, forced laugh. The sound didn't reach Elridge as humor. It registered as ritual, a shared code of class, exclusion, and casual cruelty. The landing gear touched down with a soft thud and a brief upward jolt that passed through every spine on board. There was a pause in the cabin as passengers acknowledged the touchdown, a moment of polite relief. Then came the usual shuffle, seat belts unbuckling prematurely, overhead bins opening, attendants calling for patience. The woman across the aisle stood before the seatbelt light had fully dimmed, reached into the overhead compartment, and pulled down a designer bag. As she turned, her elbow bumped Elridge's shoulder. She didn't apologize. She didn't even glance at him. She simply stepped into the aisle and angled her body away from his, as if even brushing against him had been a mistake. Elridge remained seated. He had no rush. He had learned long ago that being first off the plane meant little, if the world you were stepping into already decided your worth. Still, he watched with quiet precision, eyes noting the expressions, the nervous glances, the sudden need to avoid contact. He had become radioactive, a presence to be avoided even after the flight ended. Then something shifted. Two flight attendants moved quickly from the front galley to the cockpit. Jessica followed, her heels clicking in uneven rhythm. There was a brief conversation through the half-open door, too quiet to catch, but the body language was sharp, gestures, nods, urgency. A few passengers noticed and leaned into the aisle, curious. Elridge didn't move, but he listened, absorbing the tone, the shift in tension. The co-pilot stepped out for a moment, walked past row 1, and paused briefly as his eyes landed on Elridge. There was a flicker, just a second, of recognition. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But his jaw tightened slightly, and then he returned to the cockpit. The moment passed, but something inside Elridge clicked into place. The door at the front of the cabin opened, and an airline representative stepped inside, wearing a navy blazer with a polished name tag and a tense smile. She spoke quietly to Jessica, who nodded and whispered something back, her tone hushed but tight with discomfort. The representative's eyes moved slowly through the cabin. Then she stepped forward and addressed the passengers with a rehearsed apology. Due to a technical miscommunication with the gate, they would need to hold passengers on board for an additional 5 minutes before disembarking. Murmurs filled the cabin. Some groaned. Others returned to their phones or watches, irritated by the delay. Elridge, however, felt the air shift. He knew when attention was being repositioned. He knew when space was being cleared, not for inconvenience, but for correction. A tall man in a charcoal suit boarded the plane moments later. His walk was precise, each step measured. No blazer, no airline pin, just a black tie, press shirt, and an earpiece barely visible behind his left ear. He didn't look at the passengers. He didn't need to. He walked directly to Elridge's row and stood at attention. The cabin fell into a strange silence, like the kind that comes when a room realizes it had misread the context. The man didn't speak. Instead, he offered a respectful nod, barely visible, and waited. Jessica moved toward them, clipboard in hand, trying to speak. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask if you," she began, but stopped when the man in the suit turned his head slightly, his gaze sharp. She backed away with a small step, confusion blooming in her expression. Elridge remained seated, eyes lifted to meet the man's without expression. Finally, he spoke. "Did they move the bag?" he asked, voice low but controlled. The man nodded once. "It's been returned. We're ready when you are, Mr. Monroe." Jessica's eyes widened slightly. The passengers around them began to shift in their seats, glancing at one another, murmuring. The name meant something. Not to all, but to enough. The man in the linen shirt 3 rose, a head stiffened visibly. The woman with the designer purse adjusted her posture, suddenly unsure. But Elridge didn't stand. "Not yet. Return it to its original position," he said, nodding toward the overhead bin above his seat. The man gave a slight bow of the head and turned, speaking into the small mic clipped beneath his collar. Moments later, a second man boarded the aircraft, carrying Elridge's canvas duffel with both hands, as if it were precious. He placed it in the overhead bin carefully, then stepped back. The silence in the cabin was now thick, pulsing with discomfort. Jessica stepped forward again, lips parted, apology clearly forming, but Elridge raised one hand. She stopped mid-step, her voice dying before it formed. Passengers who had ignored him moments before now turned their heads. Curiosity peaked and unease rippling through the rows like a silent tide. The man with the linen shirt stiffened, and a woman nearby tightened her grip on the armrest. Flight attendants exchanged glances, the veneer of their composure beginning to crack under the weight of what was unfolding. Jessica stepped back, her lips pressed into a thin line, the earlier arrogance replaced by hesitation. The black-suited man who had returned Elridge's bag stood nearby, his posture rigid but respectful, ready to support whatever came next. Elridge's gaze swept the cabin, not accusing but steady, taking in each face as though weighing the unspoken truths between them. The silence was deep and palpable, an invisible thread pulling tight. Then, without a word, Elridge extended his hand and removed the crisp boarding pass from his cardigan pocket, holding it aloft for all to see. The simple act ignited a quiet storm. Passengers leaned forward, their murmurs growing louder but careful, like a wave building beneath a glass floor. The boarding pass gleamed under the cabin lights, the airline's logo clearly printed, the name, Elridge Monroe, in bold black letters. It was not just a ticket, it was a declaration. The man who had endured hours of quiet scorn was not a stranger, not an accident. He was entitled. More than that, he was essential. Behind him, the black-suited man stepped forward and pulled from a slim briefcase a small leather-bound book embossed with gold lettering. It was a shareholder registry, a document that listed the airline's major investors and stakeholders. Elridge opened it carefully, fingers steady despite the weight of attention. He turned to the page marked with his name, the ink sharp, the percentage of ownership substantial, 9.8%. His stake in the airline was not just financial, it was power. The moment stretched as passengers realized that the man they had ignored, sneered at, and excluded was a significant part of a very company whose luxury they were enjoying. The dynamic shifted instantaneously. Whispered apologies floated from a few seats, heads bowed in embarrassment. A couple across the aisle exchanged looks of regret, the woman reaching to touch the man's arm as if seeking reassurance that what they had witnessed was real. Flight attendants adjusted their uniforms nervously. Jessica swallowed hard. Her earlier confidence dissolved into silence. The airline representative who had addressed the cabin earlier stepped forward again, her voice calm but heavy with formality. She announced that the airline valued all its shareholders deeply and apologized for the miscommunication that had led to the discomfort on board. She promised a full review and retraining for the staff involved. Elridge closed the book with a deliberate snap. The power of names and numbers had spoken louder than any confrontation could have. Yet he said nothing else. He did not demand apologies or explanations. He simply took his seat back, his presence now unquestioned, his dignity restored not by words, but by undeniable truth. In the minutes that followed, the atmosphere in the cabin softened, but the lesson lingered like a shadow. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, aware of their own judgments and the price of silence. The man with the linen shirt avoided Elridge's gaze altogether, and the woman with the designer purse seemed to shrink in her seat. Jessica busied herself at the front, her smile forced but sincere. For Elridge, the moment was quiet victory. Passengers who had only minutes ago been comfortably settled in their privileged seats now found themselves glancing nervously around, as if expecting the walls to close in or the ground to shift beneath their feet. The man in the linen shirt 3 rows ahead, who had once chuckled at Elridge's expense, sat rigidly upright now, his earlier smirk replaced by a tight line of anxiety. His eyes flicked repeatedly toward Elridge's seat, as though searching for signs of the man's next move. The woman with the designer purse clasped her hands in her lap, fingers tightening until the knuckles whitened, her breathing shallow. The crew members, too, reflected the shift in mood. Jessica's earlier forced smiles dissolved into tight-lipped silence. Her eyes avoided Elridge's gaze entirely, and she kept her distance as she moved through the cabin. Courtney, who had earlier been complicit in the quiet scorn, stood stiffly near the galley, her posture betraying her unease. The airline representative who had addressed the passengers moments ago was now occupied with a whispered phone call, her voice low but tense, eyes flicking back toward Elridge's row more frequently than necessary. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the captain's voice returned over the intercom, steady but formal. The usual welcome back was replaced with an announcement that due to a scheduling change, disembarkation would be coordinated and managed carefully to allow VIP passengers priority exit. Passengers shifted restlessly. For many, this was standard procedure. For some, a warning. The black-suited man who had escorted Elridge earlier now stood at the front of the cabin with a radio in hand, speaking softly into the device, but with authority that silenced the murmurs around him. He nodded once, and within moments, a discreet team of airline security personnel appeared near the aircraft door, dressed in plain clothes but unmistakably official. They moved with precision, scanning the cabin and exchanging coded glances. The implication was clear. The situation was now under serious internal review, and no one who had caused discomfort would escape scrutiny. Elridge, despite his calm exterior, could feel the change in energy around him. He sat back in his seat as the cabin door opened and the bustle of ground personnel entered. Crew members began distributing printed statements to each row, apologizing again for the earlier mishandling of the flight and promising full investigation and personnel review. The statements were careful, measured, but carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. As passengers read them, some lowered their heads in realization. Others glanced sideways at their neighbors, as if seeking confirmation that the discomfort and exclusion had not gone unnoticed by those in power. Jessica was summoned to a private area near the front of the plane. Elridge watched her walk away, her steps hesitant, the confident posture of the flight's start replaced by something more uncertain. The man in the linen shirt hastily gathered his belongings and left the aircraft as soon as the doors opened, avoiding eye contact with any passenger. Outside the window, black SUVs waited by the jetway, engines humming softly, ready to escort Elridge away from the scene that had so recently defined him as an outcast. When Elridge finally rose to leave, he moved deliberately, each step echoing softly on the polished floor. As he passed rows of now quiet passengers, many looked away, unable to meet the eyes of the man who had silently endured so much and who now commanded the respect that had been denied to him. As he reached the door, he paused and glanced back once, not with anger, but with quiet dignity. Elridge Monroe stepped off the plane into the bright morning light of the airport, the cool air a stark contrast to the tension that still clung to his skin. The black SUVs waiting at the jetway looked less like luxury transportation and more like the heralds of a reckoning, their glossy surfaces reflecting the pale dawn as they idled quietly. Behind him, the plane's door closed with a definitive hiss, sealing off a chapter of humiliation and silent endurance. As he moved toward the waiting vehicles, the hum of airport life swelled around him. Luggage wheels clicking, distant announcements, the murmur of travelers beginning their days. But Elridge's steps were deliberate, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired and the promise of what was to come. Word of the flight's incident had spread rapidly through the airline's executive channels, forcing an immediate response from the highest levels of management. The company's leadership convened a meeting not just to address the public fallout, but to conduct a thorough internal review that would reshape policies and accountability across the board. At that meeting, Elridge was present, not as a victim, but as a force of change. His quiet endurance and composed revelation had ignited a spark that no apology or statement could quench. His name became synonymous with resilience and justice in a corporate culture that had long ignored uncomfortable truths. Within days, Jessica and several other crew members involved in the incident were suspended pending investigation. Human Resources launched mandatory retraining sessions focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but more importantly, they re-evaluated the company's entire approach to customer service and staff accountability. Elridge's experience was documented, analyzed, and incorporated into training modules to ensure that no passenger would ever endure the same treatment again. But justice was not only about corrective action within the airline. It resonated beyond the cabin walls. Media outlets caught wind of the story, and soon it became a topic of national conversation. Interviews with Elridge emphasized the subtle but powerful forms of exclusion that persist even in places designed to project comfort and privilege. His calm yet firm message challenged society to examine how assumptions and silent biases perpetuate injustice daily. Through it all, Elridge remained a figure of quiet strength. He refused to be defined by the humiliation he suffered, but chose instead to be a catalyst for transformation. The man who had once been invisible on that plane now stood in the spotlight, not because he demanded it, but because his dignity demanded recognition. Months after the flight, the airline publicly announced a comprehensive diversity initiative, dedicating resources and leadership attention to creating an environment where every customer and employee felt valued and respected regardless of race or background. Elridge was invited to serve as a consultant for the initiative, ensuring that his experience informed tangible change rather than fading into a forgotten apology. The journey was far from over, but the course had been set. The message at the heart of Elridge's story spread wider than the confines of the airline industry. It became a call to action against complacency and complicity. It reminded the world that justice often begins quietly, in moments of endurance, in acts of truth told without bitterness, in the refusal to accept exclusion as a norm. It reminded people that dignity is not given lightly, but it is also not surrendered without fight. Elridge's final words in an interview echoed in the minds of many. The true measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable, not its most privileged. His ordeal, once a personal trial, had transformed into a universal challenge, a challenge to confront the invisible walls built by silence and fear. As Elridge stepped into one of the waiting SUVs, the driver closed the door gently behind him. The vehicle pulled away from the gate and into the pulse of the airport, ready to carry him forward. But behind him, the story remained, a beacon for those who would fight not just for themselves, but for all who had ever been unseen, unheard, or dismissed. The quiet man in the faded cardigan had become a symbol of relentless truth, a reminder that in every act of endurance lies the power to change a world. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, please hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated with all our latest releases. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Elridge's journey? Was there a particular moment that stood out to you? Also, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your feedback means a lot and helps us create stories that resonate with you. Thanks for being here and supporting our channel.